Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's study session for the City of Casa Grande. The first item on our agenda is the transit governance. Dwayne, you in charge of this?
I guess so. Mayor, City Council, there's 4 of us here tonight, that's how important.
All right.
Irene Haynes, Executive Director of the Stakeholder Workshops, Travis Ashbaugh, Travis with CAG, Transportation Plan, and Amy Moran from Wilson and Company. Amy's going to do all the talking as usual when she comes. So, Amy, the rest of us are here, of course, to ask questions.
Well, thank you, Dwayne. Mayor McFarland and members of the council, thanks for having me again today. I know that I've been before you once before to talk about this study and.
Well, it's not even on.
Oh, well, I could hear myself just fine. So today we're really going to focus on just kind of a refresh on what the process was. And the study itself has wrapped up. It's been about 1.5 years in the making. And so we've got some recommendations based on the various analysis and discussion that we've had. So after we talk about the study process, we're going to talk a little bit about the different governance models that we looked at, and then eventually what the recommendations of the study were and some initial implementation steps. I do want to remind everyone that this study was really about looking at potential modern models to administer and govern transit services throughout Pinal County. It did not focus at all on actual route structuring or future route expansions. So the study process in itself essentially consisted of 6 main steps. The first one was identification of the characteristics of the existing transit service. That was really just to get an understanding of what the current population is, what potential future population is, socioeconomic characteristics, really as an indication of what potential expansion needs there could be to understand what this governing responsibility might be looking into the future. There was also a comprehensive peer review. The purpose of that was really to look at other transit agencies in the West that were communities with similar characteristics, size and population of Casa Grande, and to understand the different models that they had to govern regional transit. So we'll talk about that in just a minute here. There was also an extensive stakeholder coordination. There were several interviews both at the elected official level and the staff level so that we could understand what people's current positions were with regard to transit in Pinal County, what the needs might be, and what they thought might be some valuable ideas and considerations moving forward when we're thinking about governing transit at the regional level. From all of that peer review and the stakeholder feedback, we identified 3 separate governance models. I'll go into those in detail in just a little bit. But really the goal was kind of to weigh what the pros and cons are and to understand what might be the best fit for Pinal County and its communities. Once we got through that process, we had 2 stakeholder workshops where we presented and provided an overview of those 3 different governance models. And we asked the folks at those workshops to kind of weigh in. What did they like about them? What did they not like about them? Where did their preferences lie? And then, of course, that led us all to documentation of the process, the findings, and what the initial recommendations were based on that entire process. We also identified some preliminary measures that should be taken to help implement the recommended strategy. And throughout it all, we had a pretty extensive technical working group that met at each of the key stages in the process to really just provide insight and guidance as we continued through the effort. So as I mentioned, essentially we identified 3 separate governance models. The first one is kind of what we might think of as status quo, and that's locally oriented transit. Essentially, the various jurisdictions continue to implement transit service for their community And if they choose to, they can cooperate and collaborate with each other. But ultimately, each of those individual jurisdictions is providing the staff and the finances to fund those transit services. The second model is sort of the other end of the spectrum. And what that is it said everybody, all the local jurisdictions are sort of going to forego their responsibility as it relates to delivering local transit service, and everybody's going to join together under an umbrella for a host agency, a consolidated agency that would have representatives from the various jurisdictions. But it would be that one main governing agency that would take the responsibility for administering all of the transit service in the county. And of course, along with that, there could be the potential for optional advisory committees, so stakeholders, citizens, folks that have interest in transit services. And then the third model was a combination, more or less, of the first two. It's a hybrid model. And in this particular model, there is a regional transit agency that is established. It will administer countywide transit service, but it's up to each of the jurisdictions to decide whether they want to opt in and participate in that regional agency, or if they choose to continue to deliver transit services on their own. And so with that, we basically took that to the stakeholders. We asked for their feedback on a variety of topics, kind of the pros and cons, what did they like. And there was general support for the consolidated model. So that's the one where everybody falls under one umbrella agency. It's the most cost effective, so as you can imagine, if you have different jurisdictions that are each hiring a transit administrator and operating those services, if you have one consolidated agency that's doing that, that person or individual will be responsible for multiple jurisdictions. There was a thought that that consolidated model would probably be most effective in improving regional transit service and then leveraging the federal funds. But in reality, the preference was for the hybrid model. Really, it's just politically more acceptable. It gives the communities more flexibility to decide at the community level what their preferences are with regard to administering transit service for the community. So with that, we said, okay, we're going to look at this hybrid model, and we're going to understand what would be potential ways to implement that. So we've got this recommendation, look at this hybrid governance model, and really there were three options that were identified through this process. The first was, well, what if the Pinal Regional Transportation Authority took over that overarching role as the governing body? That was one of the options. The second was, well, what if Central Arizona Regional Transit did it? So CART. I mean, they've been administering transit for a very long time here in Pinal County. And so obviously there's some merit to that strategy as well. And then the third option would be, well, what if we just bring in and create an entire new organization that's independent of anything that's currently happening, and have that take on that role? So we looked at kind of what the advantages and the disadvantages were of each of those. With the PRTA, obviously, they have some local responsibilities with regard to allocating funding for transit service. It would be a logical extension that they could take on that role. Of course, it now introduces a new agency into the mix. They don't currently have anybody that's administering transit programs, so they'd have to take on that responsibility and hire some individuals who would be capable of doing that. CART, again, they obviously have experience. They've been doing it for decades. That certainly could have value. Sort of the disadvantage associated with that is because CART is actually a program, if you will, that is administered by the city of Coolidge. There are some requirements to revise CART's actual governance structure in order to have them provide shared services throughout the county. Because currently, as I said, it's a program. CART is not directly receiving funds from the Federal Transit Administration. It's the city of Coolidge that is. And so there would be some modifications that would be required to their structure. And then, of course, a new agency, sort of similar to the PRTA. It doesn't exist. I mean, that's different from the PRTA, but it's an agency that doesn't exist, so you'd have to find the folks to bring on board and administer that transit. Again, it probably offers flexibility, though, that it's a standalone agency that would be solely focused on providing transit services. So while the study itself carried through all three of those as viable options, when tasked with implementation, sort of what would be the steps if we wanted to do this for Pinal County, we elected to just take the PRTA as an example of this and say, all right, let's assume that the PRTA is doing it. What would need to happen in order to have the PRTA take over these responsibilities? And so really recognizing that this is an existing body. In the past, it has had a transit subcommittee. There would be a need to reinstate that transit subcommittee so that they could focus on these topics. Similar to some of the other committees that exist with the PRTA, there would be a need to establish goals and a policy framework that would talk about how this transit authority would be governed of itself, what are their rules, what are their policies. And of course, then they'd have to hire somebody with specific expertise to administer the transit service. So assuming that we now have a new transit administrator for this countywide program, we thought of some initial steps that they would be responsible for after they came on board. The first we thought was sort of some low-hanging fruit. Let's look at implementing the regional park and ride development plan. There are monies identified. There are some sites identified in the PRTA transportation plan for that. We thought that could be a good starting point to try to locate some of those early on. There are, of course, needs to coordinate with the varied human service providers. So those are the folks that independent agencies that are providing service, for example, to the elderly or disabled, medical transport, those sort of things. So the public dial-a-ride services, and how could maybe those operate more cohesively and efficiently. And then really just focusing on supporting the development of both the local and regional transit, that sort of collaboration among the different transit providers. Because again, remember in the hybrid model, there would be this overarching governing body that could be responsible for some of the regional components of the transit service. There may be jurisdictions that would choose to continue to administer the transit on their own. And so really that effort to say, okay, if we do have local jurisdictions that are going to continue to provide their own local service, how can we sort of weave those all together in a way that makes the most sense for countywide service? And so I think that the real goal in this is recognizing that whatever method is selected to administer this hybrid model, it's all about collaboration and trying to consolidate and be efficient about the way that services are provided throughout the county. So there's going to be a need to initiate discussions among the various service providers that exist today, as well as potential new service as it comes on board in future years. And really just to understand through the varying governing bodies, what are their comprehensive goals, how do they align, and again, how can all the various services be coordinated so that there's not a high degree of overlap, so that all of these are running efficiently. Of course, just understanding what are the baseline resources for each of the agencies and how can they best be utilized, and then identifying if there's a need for formal collaborative agreements, maybe being a facilitator of establishing those agreements. So with that, I am not Bethany Whitaker, but she was the project manager with Nelson Nygaard, who is the prime on this. Wilson & Company, we're sub-consultants, but thank you for having me today, and of course I will open it up to any questions that you may have.
So did you guys then kind of come to the conclusion that the PRTA would be the best option?
The formal recommendation from the study itself is that the hybrid model is the preferred alternative for countywide governance. The 3 different options were presented. They're all viable options at this point. The PRTA seems like it could be a logical choice, but again, that's something that still needs to be determined. You know, fingers crossed, you know, a positive result from the ongoing Supreme Court case. We'll see where that takes the PRTA. But in reality, the focus is truly on the recommendations for the hybrid model. The PRTA, as I mentioned, was a viable option, and that was the one that was selected to simply demonstrate once you have this overarching governing agency, what would be the sort of those initial steps to get it going.
Okay. Lisa?
Well, thanks for being here. No, I'm happy to see the results of this study, but of course it would be nice to have even more information, you know, as far as where we are moving forward. But, you know, you talked about collaboration and consolidation. And in this study, were you able to get an idea of where some of these cities are on? I mean, it looks like the option of the hybrid option was the recommendation, but you know, if you consolidate and collaborate, and no cities are going to do it. I mean, they're just, you know, we're just saying this is a good option, but you know, is there going to be participation? Because I would imagine it would be most effective if you have a large number of cities working together and doing, you know, regional transportation, and it'll benefit all of the counties. So, so basically, my question is, did you get a feel for where municipalities are on their participation and where, you know, in moving forward in this model?
So, Mr. Mayor and members of the council, when we had those stakeholder workshops, that was truly the intent, was to try to gauge what the individual jurisdictional representatives felt about these different service models. And, you know, recognizing that there was consensus that the consolidated model made a lot of sense, but that the preference and recommendation was for the hybrid model. I would say at this point, maybe folks want to have the flexibility to sort of test the waters and see how things go. So I don't know that I can speak for any particular jurisdiction as to where they might fall. I do think that there was interest in the option. But again, I think it's going to really take the formation of this agency and have them start going in proof of concept, if it be with the initial administration of park and ride lots, maybe some coordination of the dial ride and human services programs. And I think it's going to be on a jurisdictional basis.
Part of the issue is we have a couple existing systems out there. Maricopa has one.
Right. And Coolidge.
Coolidge/Florence kind of have one. And so there's some territorialism that's already built into this process. So your question's a good one, because it's still a good question and still hasn't really been answered, in my opinion. I think it's still out there.
And that's what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid we're going to just kind of keep spinning, and no one's going to want to, you know, put that step forward, which I understand those 2 cities already have systems in place. But gosh, I would love to see us working with them, because they've already worked out a lot of kinks. And
well, that's, I think, the reason why the PRTA piece makes some sense, because you can move forward with some of the park and ride and some of the transit piece, and yet leave the others independent because they're still there. So, and that may be, to your point, may be the direction that we're going to have to go in order to get down the road, so to speak, so that we can kind of move forward with this and not keep talking about transit.
Well, Mr. Mayor and members of the council, I would agree with what you say. As I mentioned, I think there may be a bit of need for proof of concept to get this agency started. I think that the jurisdictions that are currently providing transit service do see the value in consolidating the more or less administrative costs associated with having individuals reporting for the receipt of federal transit monies is rather arduous and extensive, and you need somebody knowledgeable to do that. And so there definitely would be benefit to having one individual who is sort of responsible. I know, just as an example, the city of Maricopa, the individual who administers their transit, it's a part of the job duty. It's part-time, so as you can imagine, when it comes that time of year where they're required to do their federal reporting, it can be a little overbearing. So I do think that they recognize the value in having an individual or a group of individuals that's very knowledgeable about that, familiar with the process. And it could, free up some of the costs that are associated with having each of those individual jurisdictional transit administrators.
Matt?
Yeah, I mean, that's my fear. The mayor said it, we talked it to death. We need to take some action, and we're going to have to take the lead if we want this to go once we see the financial proposals. But you keep saying park and ride, but what good is a park and ride if there's nothing to ride? I mean, we need to make a decision about something, and far be it from me. 5 years ago, I would have said absolutely not, but we've seen some sustainable financial models that wouldn't, that would work. And we've talked about it, but I mean, it's frustrating for me personally because we still we have nothing, and we keep saying park and ride, but there's plenty of parking around town, but there's nothing to ride.
Well, I think what Bethany's here to talk about is really the county-wide governance, not per se our local transit.
Okay, which makes
So I mean,
sense to
they're
me.
kind of two different things.
Yeah, but it's interrelated because
No, I
Yeah,
totally.
if someone doesn't step up, then again,
Yeah.
Gotcha. I
there's
totally agree.
nothing to.
Totally agree, Matt.
But I mean, again, I appreciate what you guys have done, and it's a very delicate thing because no one wants to give up their own control. But I think to work together, we're gonna have to figure out how to extend that olive branch or make that step, to say, hey, this is gonna work, and someone's gonna have to step up and do it first. Maybe us,
Yeah. Donna?
And thank you for being here and the information. And I think that one of the things that we have to be mindful of is that, we talk about kind of a competitive, and we're talking about, a lot of people want to go to work and they need a place to go to work. But the other side of that, I know that Maricopa used to take people to the valley and they're not doing that anymore. They want people to stay in their town and shop. And so we have to be mindful that perhaps some of those other entities might be afraid that some of that will come to Casa Grande, and that's a possibility. So I think that, as we move forward, collaborating with them and making sure that they understand the purpose and that they benefit from it as well. But I agree with you, Matt, it's time to kind of move on and get something done.
And I know you're just the messenger tonight, so don't take that the wrong way.
Mayor?
Bob, go ahead.
This question may be for you, but what is our next step if we are leaning towards PRTA management of a
Regional.
what do we need to do?
Well, I think from the perspective of having the PRTA as the governing body, I think the first step is to just hold out till we hear the decision from the Supreme Court. Then it would be to reconvene that transit subcommittee. So there are individuals that have been identified, representatives from each of the PRTA jurisdictions that would be members of that transit subcommittee. That transit subcommittee could convene and start talking about some of these options. Once it's determined, whatever that sort of governing agency is going to be, there's going to be a need to establish the governing board. There's going to be a need to hire, as I mentioned, a transit administrator, somebody who's knowledgeable about the requirements. And then I do think it's Casa Grande I will mention because you say that you'd like to see some steps. I know that staff is currently working on getting designated as a recipient. I guess I'm done talking. Of federal funds. And I guess one of the things that I will mention is that, there are both urbanized, Casa Grande urbanized area, and then there are rural areas such as Coolidge within the county. And the way that the federal transit funds work is there are different bins of money for urbanized areas versus rural areas. And so I guess I would emphasize that even if Casa Grande were to elect to join a sort of overarching regional transit governing body, the monies that are allocated for the urbanized areas will need to be spent in the urbanized areas to provide the service. So there are some distinctions about how those funds can be used and how they can be intermixed. And that would be part of the administrative function and part of that sort of coordination and collaboration process.
It's a nice way of saying it gets complicated.
Yeah. Of course.
Yeah.
But a nice way of saying it would be good to have an expert, so we're not piecing it all
Right.
together, right?
Mhm, true.
Any other questions for Bethany? Anyone, comments or questions? Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, thank you for having me again. It's always a pleasure.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you.
And I've been told to wipe down the podium.
All right, there's nothing else, then we'll stand adjourned for the next 4 minutes, and we'll start the city council meeting at 7 o'clock.